Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our ADAS Soils and Nutrients webinar, Cover Crops Research into Practice. My name is Rachel Thorman, and I'm joined today by Anne Bhogal and Kate Smith, who will share their knowledge and results from recent research carried out on cover crop management, including overwinter nitrate leaching losses and impacts on cash crop yields. Before we get started though, I need to run through a bit of housekeeping. All your microphones will be automatically muted throughout the webinar, but we do encourage audience participation. So please do, if you have any questions, post them in the question box. After each presentation, we'll have time for a couple of questions relating to that specific talk. But at the end of the presentations, we will hope to bring in any of the remaining questions that we have in a Q&A session. If we don't have time to get through all the questions, Anne and Kate will follow up with these after the event. We'll be using polls during the webinar, so please do participate and click on any answers that are relevant to you. The webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a link to this recording after the event. For those of you in the UK who are BASIS registered, there's one basis point available. Please enter into the question box your full name and your BASIS number. That's the number that begins with 200. And we will send your details onto BASIS afterwards. Last but not least, you will receive a link to a short survey about an hour after the webinar has finished. Please do take a few moments to fill in this feedback to us. It will be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. So it is now my very great pleasure to introduce Anne, who will share some practical guidance on cover crop choice, management and potential benefits in her presentation, Making the Most of Cover Crops. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. So I'm Anne Bhogal. I'm a soil scientist in ADAS, working on soil and nutrient management, one of those management practices being cover crops. And I'm going to take you through some work looking at how we can make the most of cover crops, drawing on a number of projects, but mainly the AHDB Maxi Cover Crop project that was published earlier this year. So, at the outset, I actually want to try and gauge sort of your thoughts on cover cropping. And so I've got a bit of some audience participation. And so we're going to go to a poll now where I'd like you to click answers to the questions. So the first question I've got is, do you include cover crops in your rotation? Now, I recognise that some of you are not farmers, so obviously that will be the non-applicable box. But for those farmers amongst you, it'd be really interesting to know what your experience is with cover crops at the moment. So if you can click yes or no, that would be great. So can we have the answers to that, please? Right, so obviously most of you are not farmers, but there's a mix of farmers who use both cover crops and those who don't. So if we can move to the next question that I've got for the farmers amongst you. And this next question is, if you use or you plan to use cover crops, what is your main reason? So I just want you to select one option here. Is it to reduce nutrient losses, control erosion, improve soil structure, build soil fertility, or manage pests and soil-borne diseases? And if I haven't covered anything there, perhaps you want to put something in the chat that I might have missed out in your consideration of why you want to use cover crops. So can I have the answers to that one, please? Right, so that's quite interesting, quite a mix, but the majority looking like improving soil fertility and structure and nutrient losses. That's great. So the next question, please. So the final one is, if you don't use cover crops, what is the main barrier? And if you do, what do you actually see as the main barrier to adoption of cover cropping? So again, the rotational conflicts, weed pressure, costs, or not enough information. And again, if there's something that I've missed out, perhaps put it in the chat and we can pick up on it later. So again, can we have a quick look at the answers there? Okay, that's interesting. So cost being a key one, not enough information. So hopefully I might be able to answer some of those questions there, but rotational conflict being a key one as well. So that's really interesting. Thank you for your participation there. So there was actually a recent survey by Tom Storr of 100 farmers, and he asked the question, why don't you use cover crops? And these were the top reasons why cover crops weren't used. The key one, as you've identified, they don't fit with the current rotation. Another one you've identified as the expense. And the third was the difficulty in measuring the benefit. So not understanding what the benefit was, so not really seeing how that would be a benefit to their system. So I've got a list of why you should perhaps consider cover cropping, which we picked up on already in the poll. One of the key ones right at the very outset of why we might look at cover cropping is from a soil protection, water quality point of view. So protecting soils from erosion and nitrate leaching over winter, so providing that cover. So thereby retaining nitrogen and phosphorus in the systems to improve soil fertility, but also protect watered. But over recent years, there's been increased interest in the potential for cover crops to improve soil structure, water holding capacity, porosity. And this is by the roots and the fresh organic matter being returned into the soil, thereby improving overall soil health. As I've identified in the poll, there's weed management benefits, disruption of pest and disease cycles. It can also provide habitat and increase biodiversity, and is an option within the countryside stewardship scheme. And then for some farmers, there's the option for a financial return by providing overwinter forage for sheep. So just to go through a couple of examples of those benefits. This is some work we've done with Portsmouth Water, looking at protecting water quality down in Hampshire on the shallow soils there over chalk. And this is working with farmers, so working in a farmer's field and getting the farmer to establish tram lines of different cover crop treatments and measuring nitrate leaching over the winter period. So this farmer had a very simple oat cover crop, so farm safe seed, so a fairly cheap option compared to no cover crop, a stubble treatment, compared to a mix of Phacelia and oats. And that cover crop mix would have qualified in the past for an EFA payment, a greening payment. Interestingly, his oat cover crop in this season, 2018, didn't establish particularly well. So the amount of cover he got on that treatment was actually the lowest of all the treatments. So on the stubble, he actually had a good cover of weeds and volunteers. So about 45% cover. But the Phacelia and the oats did absolutely brilliantly, 90% cover. And you can see how that relationship between the amount of nitrate lost in leaching with the percentage cover. So a really good cover crop, really knocking back those nitrate leaching levels. And this meant that when he came into the spring, his soil N supply was greater where he had the Phacelia cover crop. So that's looking at the amount of nitrogen in the cover crop and in the soil ahead of planting his spring barley. So he was able to knock back his fertiliser recommendation by about 30 kilos on the Phacelia treatment. And that had no impact on his crop yields when it came to harvest, which was a really positive story. So the other key benefit of cover cropping is to improve soil structure and biological activity. So again, this is some work from the Maxi Cover Crop project, again, working with farmers on their fields using field scale comparisons. So this was at a monitor farm, an AHDB monitor farm down in Kent, where the farmer established 2 different mixes of cover crop, a very simple mix, a 2-way mix of oats and clover, and then a more complex mix, a 5-way mix, compared to no cover, the control treatment. And this graph just shows the penetration resistance with depth. And you can see that the blue line, which is the control treatment, no cover, had a higher resistance to penetration between about 10 and 20 centimetres depth. So there was an improvement in the soil structural quality where we had that cover crop present. Moreover, at this site, we also counted earthworms. And we did this actually in the winter crop. So he established the cover crop, then put in spring barley, then put in winter wheat. And we went in the spring of that winter wheat crop, so a year after the cover crop had been in place, and counted earthworms. And you can see a nice increase in the number of earthworms we counted with the diversity of the species mix that we used. So an improvement in biological activity linked to the species mixes. So lots of good reasons why cover cropping is beneficial. So you've decided that it's a good thing to do, and then you're faced with lots of questions. So you want to do cover cropping, and so the first question is, what should you grow? Should it be a straight cover crop, or is it a good idea to mix it up a bit? And it really there is all about what you want to achieve, what fits with your rotation, and how much you're prepared to spend. And then when you've decided on your cover crop species mix, they then have a whole host of other questions. How are you going to establish it? Obviously, you want to get a good covering. Then how are you going to manage it going forward and eventually destroy it? And there's lots of different options there too. And really, it's very much a case of no one size fits all. It's really about testing what works for your rotation, your cropping system, and then modifying it as you go forward. But there are some pointers that we can make. And this is really where the Maxi Cover Crop project, which was funded by AHDB and was published in the spring of this year, try to address some of the questions and the outstanding knowledge gaps. And the aim of this project was to quantify the effects of different cover crops on soil properties, crop rooting and yield. Doing this on a series of experimental plot trials, but also validating what we saw in those plot trials on farmers' fields at a much larger scale. So when it came to cover crop species selection, these can be divided into 2 broad categories, either legumes or non-legumes. Do they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, or do they take it up from the soil, really? And the non-legumes can then be divided into brassicas, grasses and others. So this is a table, there's various versions of this table you can see in guidance documents of some examples of those different categories. So for brassicas, things like mustards and radishes, these have a good root system. They can be used as biofumigants. They're good at taking up nutrients, but you do have to consider their use if you have, for example, oilseed rape in your rotation. Cereals, oats, rye, these establish really rapidly. They're good for getting rapid early growth and cover, and can be good at deep rooting and accessing nutrients. But again, if you've got cereals in your rotation, you need to think about their use. Legumes, vetch, clovers, peas, these need to be established earlier than a lot of the other cover crops, especially if you want to get a decent amount of nitrogen fixation going on, because nitrogen fixation slows and stops sort of at temperatures below about 5 degrees C. And again, you need to think about whether you've got legumes in your rotation. And then the beauty of these other species, Phacelia, buckwheat, is that they don't have that rotational conflict. Phacelia in particular is very good at nutrient uptake and has good root system, but some of these are not entirely frost sensitive, so you do need to think about perhaps including them in a mix with other species that are not so sensitive to frost. And then another consideration is if you are going to use grazing to destroy your cover crop, you need to think about how much dry matter that cover crop will produce, its nutritional quality and its palatability to the grazing animal. So within maxi cover crop, we tried to select species from each of those different categories. So we had a brassica in oil radish, we had a couple of cereals, we had a couple of legumes, and a couple of these others, buckwheat and phacelia. And then we mixed those species up in mixes of increasing complexity. So a simple two-way mix of an oat and a clover, a three-way mix, and then a five-way mix. And so in terms of the performance of these cover crops, we did this at 3 experimental plot sites over 2 seasons. And we found that in September 2016, where we were delayed in getting the cover crop in, so it didn't go in until mid-September, and it was a light sandy soil, we only got about 1 tonne of biomass production and an uptake of about 25 kilos of nitrogen, with phacelia and radish being the top performers there in terms of nitrogen recovery. In the following year, we got our act together and we managed to get the cover crop in a lot earlier. The soils were slightly heavier textured and the cover crops performed much better. So we got about 3.5 tonnes of dry matter production, taking up about 70 to 90 kilos of nitrogen. And at one of the sites, we saw clear evidence that we were getting some additional nitrogen fixation, with vetch and clover being the top performers there in terms of nitrogen recovery. But one thing we weren't able to establish was when that nitrogen that had been taken up by the cover crop was released. We were unable to pick it up in the crop post-harvest. Another key feature of maxi cover crop was to look at how these cover crops rooted. There's very little data on that, this in the literature, so we felt it was an important aspect to try and look at. So this chart just looks at the single species that we grew, and it's a measure of the root length density. So that is the centimetres of root, so the amount of root in a centimetre cube of soil, in a parcel of soil, going down through the profile. And we saw that phacelia and rye were particularly good at producing a lot of roots in that topsoil horizon, then followed by radish and clover, with the control and the buckwheat treatment having low rooting in the topsoil and throughout the profile. On the control, we had various weeds and volunteers. The buckwheat frosted off and disappeared at the first frost. And didn't produce much root matter before that frost action. We then looked at rooting in the following spring barley crop to see if it was improved where we had good rooting in the cover crop, and we weren't able to establish a link between those 2 aspects of rooting. And we didn't actually see any differences in soil structural quality as a result of the different rooting patterns. But this may be because we were just looking at a single year effect in these studies. So as I've said, rotational conflicts are key, and within maxi cover crop, we saw clear evidence of that. So where you have a cereal in your rotation, growing a cereal as a cover crop, certainly as a straight cover crop, can be problematic. So here are the average spring barley yields that we got, and we saw that where we had a straight cover crop of oats or rye, yields were declined in that spring barley. But interestingly, where we had oats in our mixes, mix 1 and mix 3, we didn't see that yield decline. So it seems that actually putting it in a mix sort of dilutes the effect of having the cereal on cereal. But obviously oilseed rape in the rotation, you need to think about mustards and radishes, and pulses and legumes. Obviously vetch and clovers are potentially an issue. So briefly, just to talk about cover crop mixtures, why would you grow a cover crop mixture? Obviously it's could potentially be more expensive, but it is a way of managing your risk. If one species does not establish particularly well, you've got the other species to grow on. So for example, in the Portsmouth waterwork that I showed earlier, the oats didn't establish well, but the Phacelia really got going and was able to mop up that excess nitrogen. And there could be multiple benefits of having a mix in, as again, we saw with the earthworms. But also there's work that suggests that where you put a grass or a cereal with legume, that the legume actually performs better in terms of nitrogen fixation. But you do need to weigh it up against the additional cost, and it can be potentially more complicated when you're dealing with different seed sizes, for example. So as I said, timings are critical. So you've decided what you want to grow, and the key thing is you've got to get it in early. These are just some pictures from the Maxi Cover Crop trial, that sandy light soil where we drilled in September. This is oats, less than half a ton of dry matter when we came to destroy it, 15 kilos of nitrogen uptake, compared to oats drilled at the same rate in August. On a slightly heavier soil, we managed to get 2 tons of dry matter and 40 kilos of uptake. But timings are also critical when it comes to destruction, particularly on clay soils and in wet seasons. So these are some results from one of the farmer tramline trials we had up in Yorkshire, where the farmer had the simple 2-way mix and a 3-way mix. This is topsoil moisture content, well, moisture content down through the profile, but if you just look at the top 30 centimetres, we saw the soils were significantly wetter where we had that cover crop, sort of providing that protective cover almost, preventing evaporation. The farmer, it was a very wet spring and he had to turn the site around particularly quickly, and he destroyed the cover crop and got the beans in within a week. But those beans did not like the wet, cold soils that they were put into. And this is just a chart of the spring bean root length that we measured in May. You can see that rooting wasn't so good where we had the cover crop. And this then impacted on his final yields. You saw between 0.2 and 0.4 tonnes per hectare yield decline. So just talking a bit more about cover crop destruction, we use glyphosate in all of the trials, and by far this is the most common destruction method. But obviously there are question marks over whether glyphosate is going to be available in the future. So there's increasing interest in alternatives to glyphosate, whether that be to chop it, crimp it, squash it, roll it, disc it, graze it. There's not been so much work on that. I know there's many people having little tryouts, but really we need to understand the impact of these different destruction methods on the quality of the subsequent seedbed, the amount and timing of nitrogen release, weed populations, pest and pathogen carryover, and this dependence on weather conditions, particularly where you're crimping it or crushing it. It's best to do it when it's frosty. And there have been some tryouts, and the Innovative Farmers Field Labs are doing some really good work here. There was a field lab in 2018-19 on alternative methods. And this field lab saw no negative effects compared to glyphosate on the final crop yield. And there is a new field lab that I'd like to flag up that's just starting this autumn, looking at sheep grazing as a destruction method. And you can find out more about that on the Innovative Farmers website. The idea here being looking at the quality of the cover crop, the impact of having the sheep on soil structural quality, but also looking at nitrogen release and impacts on subsequent crop yields. So talking about crop yields, be prepared for variable effects. So these are just the results from the work we did for the farmers in Maxi Cover Crop. Basically, we took their yield map. An example of the yield map at the Kent site is here on this slide, and we analysed the yield map to look for treatment effects. And so in Kent, we saw a marginal but not significant increase in yield where we had the cover crop. The Yorkshire site, as I've alluded to, that bean site with the wet, cold soils, we saw a yield decrease. And with Huntingdon site with barley, we saw no change. So it is hit and miss. Obviously, this is just 1 year of cover cropping, and it does really need to be a long-term investment. This was with cereal crops. There are reports that actually with things like potatoes and sugar beet, the benefits are more obvious. So just to summarise at the end, I hope I've shown that cover crops are excellent at providing nitrogen uptake, erosion control, and they have soil structural benefits. But there are these list of different considerations we need to take into account in terms of species choice, drilling the cover crop as early as possible and leaving a good window between destruction and your spring crop establishment, and being prepared for those variable impacts on yields. It does very much need to be a long-term investment. And that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that overview of the points that need to be considered when you're growing cover crops. It's interesting to see that it's clearly got to be a long-term investment, and it might not go quite as you'd hoped, especially at the beginning. Right, got some questions for you. The first one is, how is the percentage of the cover crop measured?
The percentage cover, basically, yeah. We put a quadrat down and we look at the proportion in the quadrat of bare soil compared to what is covered. It's literally a metre square quadrat, and we look at the area covered versus not covered.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah. Another question, what is a biofumigant, please?
So something like mustard, they when they break down, they release I can never pronounce it, isocyanates, which can then have a fumigation effect on things like nematodes in the soil.
Brilliant. Have you been monitoring sediment yield in any of your experiments?
No, not in these particular experiments, but I know Kate will touch on sediment yield, so I don't want to steal her thunder.
And I've got a last question, I think. How did you measure the biomass, the cover crop biomass? Okay, so then again, it's simply a quadrat placed down, usually multiple, so we get a good estimate, so it's not just the one. A quadrat placed down, and you just cut the cover to ground to the surface, weigh it, dry it, weigh it, basically, and then calculate out on an area basis. So it's just looking at above ground biomass production. Brilliant, thank you. I can see we've got a shed load of questions coming in for you, but unfortunately we haven't got time just now, but we'll try and pick up as many as we can at the Q&A at the end. Thank you. Okay? Okay, thanks. So next up, I am delighted to introduce Kate, who will share some of her experimental results in her presentation, Cover Crop Management to Reduce Overwinter Nitrate Leaching Losses. The floor is yours, Kate, when your presentation appears.
Thanks, Rach. Just wait for my mouse. There we go. Brilliant. Hi everyone. So I'm a soil scientist at ADAS, and I'm just going to present some results from field demonstrations and experiments that we've been carrying out over the last few years, either with HDB, DEFRA or water companies. And these have been focused upon assessing the impact of cover cropping to reduce overwinter nitrate leaching losses. So to reduce overwinter nitrate leaching, we really want to select a cover crop species, or sometimes called a catch crop, that will take up enough nitrogen in order to minimise excess soil nitrogen before overwinter drainage starts. And ultimately, the amount of nitrogen taken up by the cover crop is going to be influenced by cover crop species, drilling date and weather conditions. And in this slide, I've just summarised some of the published data. So a review by Silger and Harrison reported that N uptake in cover crops can range from anything between 10 to 150 kilograms of N per hectare. So 150 is exceptionally high, and from our studies, we see that the top end is typically up to 70 to 90. But as mentioned, nitrogen uptake is going to vary with weather, and the table here just shows some data from a study that nicely shows that, that in a dry autumn, mean nitrogen uptake is quite a bit lower, at around 20 kilograms of N per hectare, whereas when the autumn's a bit wetter, you can expect higher end uptakes, and there's a mean of around 50 kilograms of N per hectare. And as Anne mentioned or discussed, it's important to establish cover crops early. And just as a recap, this graph shows when drilling after the 20th of August, cover crop biomass rapidly declines. And so the evidence really is it's best practice to drill a cover crop by mid to end of August. So it has the best chance of, not just simply establishing and there being a little bit of ground cover present, but to ensure that the cover crop will take up enough nitrogen to reduce that surplus nitrogen, soil nitrogen, by the start of overwinter drainage. And this will give us the best chance of reducing overwinter nitrate leaching losses. So just to show you how we measure nitrate leaching, so in sandy soils which are prone to leaching losses, we can measure nitrate using ceramic porous pots, and these have a pore size, a fine pore size, which can hold a vacuum up to 70 kilopascals. So if water in the soil is held at tensions below this, we can apply suction to the cup and move the water will move from the soil into the cup. And we can come along and take a sample after every couple of weeks, or after, say, about 25 millimetres of drainage. To install the porous pots, we use a mechanised soil auger, and they're installed at an angle of around 30 degrees. And this is just to make sure that when we're drawing water from the soil, it's been collected from areas of undisturbed soil. Okay, so just to move on to some results. So this first demonstration was one that we carried out with Angling Water, and it's to compare nitrate leaching losses from 5 different overwinter ground covers. This was done in 2017-2018. The site is located on the light sandy soil over chalk, and it's an area where nitrate leaching levels in the groundwater have been exceeding the drinking water standard. So the treatments that we had here are, bare cultivated soil, a stubble, and then we had 3 different cover crop treatments. So oats with mustard, radish with oats, and a premium mix. And the cover crops here were established by Frontier, just to say. So moving on to the results. So total nitrate leaching losses from the site were ranging from around 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on the stubble treatment to around 10 kilograms of nitrate N on the radish and oats on the premium mix. And if we look at the percentage ground cover, there's a nice relationship between ground cover and nitrate and leach. So we've seen the lowest losses on the radish with oats and the premium mix, and this corresponds where we're getting the highest above ground cover. Interestingly, in this year, the light cultivation stimulated a bit of weed growth, and it gave ground cover around 35%, and so this was enough to reduce nitrate leaching compared to leaving in stubble by around 30 kilograms of N per hectare. And just another example here, so this is some work that we've been doing with Portsmouth Water, and this was carried out in October. Nitrate leaching was measured from October 2019 to February 2020. And we've got 3 ground cover treatments. We've got oats, stubble and Phacelia. And the Phacelia had really established well, and after a month of being drilled, it was taking up 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare already, whereas on the oats and the stubble, the N uptake was much less at 2 to 3 kilograms. And you can see that where the ground cover had established well at the start of overwinter drainage, we're seeing the lowest nitrate leaching losses at less than 5 kilograms of nitrate N per hectare on the Phacelia, whereas on the stubble, it's higher at around 25 kilograms of nitrate N. So really, you know, the key is to getting the ground cover well established at the start of drainage. So I'm just going to move on to talking about maize really, and as we know, maize is a late harvested crop, and it can be harvested from the end of September through to early November. So really, there's limited opportunity to establish ground cover after harvest. And as we know, having bare ground over winter not only increases the risks of nitrate leaching, but also sediment losses and surface runoff. So there's a lot of interest in finding ways to explore how to incorporate some ground cover in maize. And I've just done a snapshot of all the bits of tweets from Twitter that you can see on this, or from the press. And you can see that DEFRA, various water companies and individual farmers and MGA are all trialling different ways of trying to get ground cover to establish in maize systems, be that strip tilling maize into established ground cover, drilling maize and grass at the same time, or by oversowing maize with a grass so it has a bit of a head start. So the reason it's so complicated to incorporate some ground cover or cover crop in maize systems is not only due to the late harvest, but also the maize really struggles with competition at the early growth stages, and this can lead to big yield penalties. So just to summarise some of the previous research, so when drilling maize and grass or clover at the same time, one DEFRA study reported reductions of 40 to 50% in maize yields. In the competitive maize DEFRA research project that we carried out with MGA, we found that strip tilling into ground cover again led to big maize reductions and it could be anything from 50 to 90%. So big yield reductions there. So an alternative method is oversowing, just to allow the maize to have that bit of head start. And in the UK, there is really limited evidence on the impacts that oversowing will have on the maize yields. And the study from DEFRA back in 2001 reported losses in the region of around 5%. The method of oversowing, there are different ways of doing it. So we can broadcast the seed, and we found that this was successful in 3 out of 5 site years. So it's really very dependent on rainfall around the time when you're carrying out the oversowing. In Denmark, they've been leading the way with looking at drilling. So they found that drilling 3 rows and leaving around about a 20 centimetre gap around the maize rows was the most effective method, and it's been found a more reliable way of establishing grass and maize. But again, it can lead to small yield reductions, and this is clearly something that we're worth looking at in the UK. So just following on from the work that we've been doing with DEFRA, we've been working with Anglian Water and to assess the impact of oversowing on maize, not only on the crop yields, but also nitrate leaching and soil structure. And given that drilling has been shown to be a more reliable method, we've been working with a contractor who's built this bespoke oversowing drill. And just a bit of information about this drill. So the bar is tall enough to pass over the maize crop without damaging it, meaning that we can oversow at the 6 to 8 leaf stage. We're drilling 3 rows of grass in between the maize rows, and we're keeping the maize rows at a width of 75 centimetres. And we're oversowing with either ryegrass or tall fescue at a rate of around 6 kilograms per hectare. So we've carried out experiments in Lincolnshire and in harvest year 2018 and 2019. And in both years, we had the treatments with maize, oversown with ryegrass and tall fescue, compared with a conventional treatment of bare ground over winter. We have our plots quite large, they're 50 metres by 100 metres in length, and this just means that we can use commercial machinery. So in 2018, we found that when oversowing, there was a rainfall just prior to oversowing, and the grass germinated really well. And if you look at the photo to the right in September 2018, you can see immediately post-harvest, we've got a good bit of ground cover. Looking at the yields, so the impact of the oversowing on the maize yields, on the conventional treatment, we have around 13 tonnes dry matter per hectare. However, yields on the oversown ryegrass and tall fescue were between 2 to 4 tonnes lower. So there was a bit of competition between the maize and the grass for light and nutrients. We repeated the experiment again at a different site in 2019. This time we had replicated pots, so we could collect more robust data about the impact on maize yields. And this year we found that the oversowing had no impact on yields, with a mean yield of around 16 tonnes per hectare across all treatments. However, the grass didn't establish as well. There was limited growth in the spring, and so little opportunity for any competition between the grass and the crop. And then come September, I'm sure we can all remember this, the very wet conditions, with double the average rainfall in September all the way through to Christmas. Well, it meant that in September the maize wasn't harvested and it was delayed till the end of October. So this delay in harvest really gave limited opportunity for the grass to get going post-harvest. Looking at the overwinter nitrate leaching losses, this is a graph for 2018 to 2019, we can see that the losses are greater on the conventional treatment, which was in stubble at around 70 kilograms of nitrate N per hectare, and on the ryegrass treatment, we can see that there's a 50% reduction in nitrate leaching losses, and this corresponds to there being a higher ground cover on that ryegrass treatment. There's a small reduction on the nitrate leaching on the tall fescue, but the ground cover of the tall fescue was less well established. And so really, you know, it just really reflects the impact that are getting a really good ground cover on maize to reduce nitrate leaching. And just to say, in 2019 and 2020, we found that the cover crop, the ryegrass and tall fescue, there was little difference between them and the conventional treatments, and that was just due to it not being as well established. So really, this research is helping to build the evidence base for the impact of oversowing on nitrate leaching and on maize yields. And it's clear that weather conditions, both in the spring and in the autumn, are going to have a big impact on the establishment of grass. And the idea is we hope to repeat this in another year, so that we can be in a position where we can give a range for the potential impacts on yield and nitrate leaching, and how this weather varies with weather conditions and season. And once we're in this position, we'll be able to discuss with farmers how they could potentially recoup any losses in yield if these are observed. And that could be through finding ways to utilise the oversown grass, be that by grazing or by using it in a digester. So having established ground cover not only helps reduce nitrate leaching losses, but can also help to reduce sediment and surface runoff losses. And as part of a DEFRA project, we measured surface runoff and sediment losses after oversowing maize. So we carried this out on large plots, and we installed these sediment traps, which you can see in the photo to the right. And these were installed across the plots, so incorporated areas that were wheeled and non-wheeled, and the water and the sediment would collect in the traps and travel down the pipes, pass through the tipping bucket, and then be stored in the storage tank at the bottom there. And from the photo that you can see in the middle there, this is of the oversown grass post-harvest. And you can see that we've got some really good ground cover established at this site. And at this site, it was actually established by broadcasting the seed. So just to look at the sediment losses that we were getting. So even on this gently sloping land, we're getting losses of over 1 tonne per hectare from the stubble treatment, so from the conventional treatments. And the ryegrass had a significant impact on reducing losses, and with losses, a 70% reduction of losses down to around 400 kilograms per hectare. Biodiverse mix, which included a mixture of legumes in there, that had less of an impact on sediment losses, but this was because it wasn't as well established as the ryegrass. So just going to change focus a little bit now, and for the last part of my talk, and we've been working with AHDB and Brian Barker for the last couple of years to understand the impact of cover cropping on water quality, crop yields, and soil quality for the last couple of years. And so this trial came about as Brian has been sampling drainage water from fields across his farm. And the water samples were analysed by Essex and Suffolk Water. This graph it's really nice. It really gives an indication about how land management can impact on water quality, in particular nitrate concentrations. So what we can see here is that fields that are down to either grass or cover crops, they have the lowest nitrate concentrations in drainage water. Again, just reflecting that ground cover there. On the winter cereals, we're seeing higher nitrate concentrations, and the highest nitrate concentration was measured on the paddy's field, which was ploughed, but no crop established. Interestingly, on the winter cereals, you can see that the nitrate concentrations on field 9 are a little bit lower than field 1 and big lawn, and this is really because the winter wheat on this field was established earlier, and so that earlier establishment is having an impact there on the nitrate concentrations and lowering them compared to a later establishment. So moving on to the cover crop trial, we had 2 field sites, and in each field site we tested a different cover crop established method. So on apple tree, we established cover crops by following ploughing, and then on blacksmiths, the cover crop was established following a strip tillage 1-pass system, which cultivated the soil down to around 20 centimetres. So each field had a split drainage system, so we could set up areas with and without cover cropping in line with the drainage systems, and that meant Brian could continue sampling drainage water over winter. And looking at the establishment, so we're finding that in this year on the 1-pass system, the cover crop established better, so there's greater biomass and more even cover. These photos just taken on the 2nd December there. By February, we saw that the cover crops had sort of caught up with each other. They produced similar amounts of biomass, with about 1.4 tonnes per hectare coming off the ploughed and 1.6 off the 1-pass system. So this equated to an offtake of around 45 kilograms of per hectare. If we look at the nitrate concentrations in the drainage water, we're seeing a really nice relationship between ground cover and nitrate concentrations. So the lowest nitrate concentrations are found on that cover crop 1-pass system, and that really reflects that it was established better earlier on compared to the ploughed cover crop. And then the highest nitrate leaching losses from the ploughing and then by the overwinter stubble. So just to summarise really, we're seeing that, as you'd expect, earlier established is really important to help reduce excess soil nitrogen, and it's important to get this done at the start of overwinter drainage so that we can have a big impact at reducing nitrate losses. And where we're having cover crops that are well established, we can reduce nitrate leaching losses by up to 90%. We've measured reductions in sediment losses, as I showed you, by 70% or even up to 90%. Volunteer weeds can have a big impact on reducing nitrate leaching losses, but where they occur, this led to reductions around 35%. And with the oversowing as a way of establishing ground cover in maize systems, we're seeing variable impacts on the yields, and we're working towards building a robust data set to understand what is typical and work out ways to fully utilise that grass once it's established. The data from the strategic farm east shows nicely that the impacts of land management, so early versus late drilling, and really if you can establish a zero earlier on, then it can have some benefits at reducing nitrate concentrations in drainage water. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Hi, that's Kate. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Some really interesting. There's some really interesting work there on oversowing maize, and excellent to hear about the on-farm demonstrations with the AHDB strategic farmer Brian Barker. That's really good stuff. Thank you. Right, we've got some questions for you. You'll be overjoyed. Yeah. The first one is, do you know, I think this is relating to that really lovely graph of with Anglian Water of the percentage of cover with nitrate leaching losses. Do you know what was in the premium mix? There's a couple of people that have been asking that.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly. It contained 5 different species, and it did include some legumes in there as well, but I can let you know that.
Brilliant. Also on the same graph, there's somebody asking for what was the cover again? Just a point of clarification. What was the point of the cover for the treatment which had just been cultivated?
So it was to look at, there's a very light cultivation and to see what impact that would have on the nitrate leaching losses. So by the light cultivation, it had, in this year, it had the benefit of stimulating enough plenty of weedy growth. Not always the case, could backfire in that it could stimulate nitrate leaching losses, in particular if you don't have that weedy growth. But this year, it did actually have an effect of stimulating that weedy growth, which showed a benefit. Now, if you can't, one theory is if you can't get in to establish a cover crop, this could be an alternative method, but you have to be careful.
Okay, thank you. One last question, I think. I think this is in relation to the strategic farm work. And when you say one pass, do you mean drilled?
Yeah, it was strip-tailed and the cover crop drilled at the same time.
Brilliant, thanks, Kate. I'm just conscious of the time, and there's a lot more questions here for Kate, which she'll follow up with you after the event. But I'm going to bring Anne back in now so that we can try and pull in some of the broad overarching questions and have a little discussion on them. And if you want to contribute to any of this discussion, please feel free to enter any comments that you have into the question box, and we'll try and bring them in as and when we can. So, ladies, there's some couple of topics which are really lots of people are interested in. And the first one really is what is happening to that nitrogen after the cover crop is destroyed? There are lots of people interested in the timing and how much. Anne, you want to kick us off with that one?
Yeah, that is one of the key questions that we're very keen to explore more. There has been some work on it, and it is very much, there's lots of factors involved that we're becoming aware of. It obviously depends on how much cover crop you've got there to start with. It also depends on the C to N ratio of that cover crop, so how resistant it is to breakdown. It depends on the soil type and the soil moisture conditions and the temperature. There's work that suggests that anywhere between a third and a half of it could come out and be picked up by the next crop, the cash crop. But then obviously there is the risk that it could actually even be coming out in the following winter, and we haven't really got a handle on that, if I'm honest. Kate, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. I mean, it's a complicated one, isn't it? And it really relies on having longer term experiments to be able to track that. I'm just thinking of the oversowing maize work. We've seen that you can see with the oversowing in 2018, this increased soil nitrogen index by 1 on the oversown compared to the conventional. What we haven't done is tracked how that's released into the following crop. So that, it would be really interesting to know that, and whether you can knock back on your bag fertilizer. And then also, thinking of other systems, so grazing cover crops, and with sheep grazing cover crops, whether that makes the nitrogen more available to the following crop. And that's something that we've started a field lab with innovative farmers, so we're going to be exploring that a little bit more, really. So.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just going to, there's quite a few people saying, are there basis points available? Yes, there are. And if you want them, please just enter your name and your basis number into the question box, and we'll forward that through to basis afterwards. Right, another hot topic appears to be costs of cover crops. Have you done any cost benefit analysis, e.g. end savings versus cost of seed establishment, etc.?
Yeah, so we have. I didn't cover that actually. So in Maxi Cover Crop, that was a key feature of the Maxi Cover Crop project. Every comparison we did with the farmers and on the plot experiments, we did a cost benefit. So we looked at the cost of the seed, the cost of the establishment, and then the yield return that we got. We didn't adjust fertiliser on those treatments. With the Portsmouth water study, we did, and we took that into account in a cost benefit. And interestingly, certainly in a cereals, with cereals, it was one occasion out of about 20 where we saw a positive gross margin of having positive benefit on the gross margin of having the cover crop present. We couldn't recuperate the cost of the cover crop seed and establishment costs in the return on the yield that we got. But that's not always the case. There are studies out there that, particularly in, say, potatoes and vegetable rotations, it tends to be a little bit more positive. But I would hasten to add that this was a one-year study in Maxi Cover Crop, and really it's sort of a long-term looking over the sort of whole rotation, multiple years of cover cropping that you really need to take into account. Kate, do you want to add anything on maize?
Yeah, I guess just as I said before, with the oversowing, there is a chance of getting reductions in maize yields with the oversowing. So there's those costs to cover in addition to the actual costs of establishing the grass as well. And whilst, like I said, we haven't taken it into a second year to see if, where you get that increase in soil nitrogen supply, if you cannot cut back on your bag fertiliser, whether there's cost savings there. That's one way of looking at cost savings. Other ways are maybe looking at ways to utilise the grass. So grazing, if you've got livestock on the farm, or looking to integrate livestock into your rotations, or using it in a digester, or simply leaving it down to grass really for the following year. It's a tricky one really. But I think the thing would be to get for maize, oversow maize, to get a handle on how the yields vary with different seasons really.
I would add that obviously it's really important to be able to try and put a value on the other benefits, sort of non-monetary benefits in some respects, so the other ecosystem service benefits, so the water quality aspects, the loss of soil, the biodiversity benefits, and putting a sort of pounds value on that really sort of needs to be taken into account. And I suppose that's where some of the schemes like countryside stewardship, some of the schemes that water companies do could perhaps come into play, and certainly would be looking to see whether it appears in the new ELMS.
Brilliant, thanks, thanks. Just time for one last question really, which again it's sort of a typical one of one of the large areas that we've been getting questions on. Is using glyphosate a good method to destroy a cover crop? Surely flailing or crimping and shallow inversion is better for organic matter and biofumigation. And do you want a little go with that?
That's a good question. That is a good question, and obviously it's something that we're really wanting to look at. Actually, really got the data on that. There hasn't really been the sort of scientific research, the scientific studies. Certainly, glyphosate is very effective at getting at clearing up the cover crop and ensuring that you haven't got any weeds going back into your rotation and that kind of thing. But definitely, certainly from a biofumigation point of view, chopping and incorporating is probably the way forward from that perspective. But really, we don't know the answer, and something that we need to address definitely.
Brilliant.
I think
Kate,
so.
anything to add?
Yeah, again, yeah, it's something that we really need to understand better. And again, with the grazing, it's a question mark whether you need to apply glyphosate or not if you're grazing a cover crop, and it all depends on how hard you're grazing and how soon after grazing you're going to establish the spring crop, really. So it is a big area with a question mark, really, that's worth looking into.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, ladies. Now, unfortunately, I'm just conscious of time. That's all we really have time for now. But thanks for everybody for all your great questions. That's been brilliant. We still have an awful lot more of them. So Kate and Anne will troll the way through them and respond to you, but please be patient. It might take them a bit of time to get through them all. So that all that leaves me is to say thank you all for joining us. Brilliant, thank you. And a reminder, please can you just fill in the survey when you'll get it in about an hour's time? That would be great, very appreciative. Thank you very much. So thank you and goodbye.